Reminded of the story happened years ago of a boy named Ian who was diagnosed with lymphoma, and he had to go through chemo with this cancer, and his only goal through cancer was he didn't want anybody to really single him out. He didn't want to be treated differently. He was able to get away with that for a little while, but as he started to go through chemo, the clumps of hair started to come out. And he had to shave his head. And now suddenly everybody knew who the boy who had cancer was in school. And every day he struggled as everybody treated him differently. Everybody kind of singled him out. And one of his friends, Kyle, came home one day and he told his parents, "I want to shave my head." And they weren't really excited about that. And they said, "Why?" And they said, because my friend Ian, he has cancer, his head shaved, and he's really having a hard time. And so we thought, me and the other guys, that if we all shaved our heads, then they wouldn't know which kid had cancer. And he wouldn't get treated differently anymore. And so, of course, the parents, they called all the other boys, they all marched down to the barbershop that night, they all got their heads shaved, and then suddenly the next day, Ian was just like every other boy in his class. And nobody knew anymore who the boy with cancer was, and he wasn't singled out. And I was reminded of this story because it was a newspaper article, and they asked the dad Ian's dad, about how he felt about what had happened. And he said, "I cannot put into words what these boys did for my son. But I believe the scripture we read today does put into words exactly what those boys did for their friend. As Paul calls us, to bear one another's burdens." That's what they were doing for their friend. They couldn't take away his cancer. They couldn't go through chemo for him. They couldn't change anything about his circumstance. But they could remind him that he wasn't alone in it. They could walk beside him as he went through it. And if shaving their head was all it took for him to feel differently day after day and give him the strength to fight that and eventually overcome it, what a small thing for them to do to show their love and care and concern for their friend. Now that may not seem like much, but it does take something to be able to do something like that for someone. It takes our ability to see it. We got to recognize those needs. We have to understand them. We have to think about, what can I do? Because often we see these big problems and we think, I can't do anything about them. There's no way for me to help them. But that's almost never true. There's always something that we can do to walk alongside one another and bear each other's burdens as we struggle through some of the hard things in life. So today I want to look first at that verse 2. And there's 3 words that are in there, and just to help us understand what we're talking about here. What does it mean to bear each other's burdens? And then we're going to go back and look at the whole passage that Mike read for us in Galatians. It's Galatians 6, 1-5, if you want to look there in your scriptures. The first word there is the word bear. And that word bear simply means to pick up or to carry. Now notice, it doesn't mean to grab a hold of. Meaning, I see somebody struggling to carry something and I say, let me grab the other side. Let me help you carry it. That's not what the word actually means. The word actually means it's too heavy, they've dropped it, they've fumbled it, it's on the ground, and you come alongside them and you pick it up for them and you carry it for them. And while we still may say, if that was too heavy for them, it might be too heavy for me too. What the word says to us is this: we bear a responsibility in how we live with one another. That we have a responsibility to each other in helping take care of one another's needs. In helping take care of one another's problems and struggles and heartaches. We are responsible for one another in the kingdom of God. Then the next word is burdens. We bear one another's burdens. And that word means weight, fullness, importance. This isn't just anything, this word means something that's crushing. It's so heavy, it's crippling. The weight of it is pressed down on you and you can't move with it. So Paul uses this word in 1 Corinthians 1:8. And he uses this word to describe the trials and struggles that he is going through in his ministry. These burdens that are so heavy, and he's giving thanks to them for their help and helping him move forward from them. They're too much for him to bear, and they are helping him in that. So these just aren't anything. These are heavy problems. These are difficult problems. And they may not be difficult for us, but they're difficult for the person who's going through them. They're weighing them down and crushing them. And the statement from Paul is that, as we look, this fulfills the law. But what does that mean? How does bearing burdens fulfill the law? Well, when Jesus was asked about the law, what did he tell us? That all of the law was summed up by what? Loving God with everything and loving our neighbor as ourselves. So what Paul is saying is the primary way that we love one another is by bearing one another's burdens. When we bear one another's burdens, we love each other the way that we are called to love one another. And in doing so, we fulfill all of the law. We demonstrate what this life is supposed to look like together. And so when we think about burdens, we could be talking about a lot of things. We might be talking about physical problems. We might be talking about somebody who has cancer like Ian did. But we also might be talking about somebody who has relational problems. And there's a brokenness in their marriage or with their kids. We might be talking about somebody who has emotional problems and they're angry or they're depressed or struggling with something. We might be talking about somebody who has spiritual problems. There's an addiction, there's a sin, there's something else in their walk with God that just isn't right. It could be grief, it could be guilt, it could be loneliness, it could be anxiety, it could be stress. There's so many different burdens that people all around us bear. They're carrying them on their own. And what God is telling us is this: you are not created to do that by yourself. We are created to do that with one another and to help one another with those things. So now let's go back to Galatians 6, 1-5. And let's pull back a little bit and look at the full context that Paul is talking about, because I think this helps guide us a little bit more on what bearing burdens is and what it isn't. First and foremost, look at verse 1. And he says, if another believer is overcome by some sin. So in this context, Paul is primarily talking about sin. And notice, who is it that we point out, that we help with a sin? Another believer. Somebody else. Why? We could go through the New Testament, but Paul talks about throughout his letters to churches that people who don't know Jesus don't know how to live like Jesus. And so we cannot hold them to the standard that we hold one another to. Those who don't know Jesus don't know what sin is. And so we can't go to them and say, hey, you're sinning, when they don't even know what sin is. It's other believers who are stuck in this that we are to help with. But it doesn't just say they're stuck in it, they have a problem. They are overcome by it. They're overwhelmed by it. They're weighed down by it. They're stuck in it. One of our greatest problems is that we live in this culture where it says Jesus told us not to judge. And we think what that means is we can never point out sin. We can never say, hey, there is a sin. And so somebody's overwhelmed and they're buried in this sin and we don't want to judge, so we're not even going to say anything to them. And what that creates is a culture in our churches that ignores sin. And that's not what we're called to either. Now, it doesn't mean we come by and say, I told you that was too heavy for you. Told you shouldn't walk along that path. No, they're overcome by sin. They're overwhelmed by it. And so I'm not going to judge them or condemn them. I'm going to help them. Right? You who are godly should gently and humbly help them. It means I shouldn't use my power to crush them in what they're stuck in. As we talked about that word gentleness a few weeks ago, I should be humble and remember, I've been stuck on the side of the road and those problems before too. I'm not going to be prideful and think I'm better. But because I'm in this position where I can, gently and humbly, I'm going to get them back on the right path. I'm going to pick them up off the side of the road and help them get back headed in the direction they're supposed to go in. They're overcome by sin. But then Paul says, second, but be careful. Helping others who are overwhelmed by burdens is dangerous. Especially if sin is that problem. Because here he says, be careful, you don't get sucked into the same sin. Sin has a gravitational pull. It pulls people in. And if you're around somebody who's stuck in that, you can easily get pulled into it and get caught up in their world. And that's not just true of sin. You get around people who are depressed or hurting, and suddenly it changes how you feel as well, right? You have to be careful when you're helping others, that you don't get pulled down and stuck on the road with them. Because two people stuck alongside the road with each other isn't any better than one person, right? We have to be careful in bearing one another's burdens that we don't get crushed ourselves underneath that weight. Then he says, and this is, in this translation I'm going to read you, I think this is one of the hardest scriptures to read. But it's one of the most important for people to hear. Listen. If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important. Man, do we know some people who need to hear that, right? But no, listen, we build ourselves up. When we talk every week, God accepts us, God loves us, God embraces us. And sometimes we can use that to feel pretty full of ourselves. And what does Paul say here? You think you're too good to help somebody. You walk by that person on the road and you are ashamed. How could they ever get stuck in that? How dare they fall into that? Why would they ever get sucked in that problem? I would never get in that problem. We just, like the Good Samaritan, we just walk by on the other side of the road and leave them stuck there. If you think you're too important to help somebody, there's going to be a day when you're stuck on that road too. Promise you. You're not that important. None of us is above helping anyone who's stuck in our problems. You're only fooling yourself if you believe that you're not strong enough, you're too strong, you're too good, you're too old, that there's somebody else. You're not that important. It's your job, it's your role to help those people in your lives. Then we get to verse 4 and 5, and some of your translations, this might confuse you, because some of the translations in verse 5 say everybody should bear their own burdens. Well, that seems to contradict verse 2, right? Just said carry one another's burdens, and now everybody should carry their own burdens. Well, the problem is in the Greek, those are two different words. All right? So if you look in the New Living here, we have in verse 4, pay careful attention to your own work. Right? Now go to verse 5. We are each responsible for our own conduct. So what this word burdens means in here that's different from verse 2. Remember verse 2, these were things that are crushing, they're too heavy for somebody to carry. This verse, in verse 4 and 5, is a military term. And every soldier in the military, as they moved from one place to another, had a responsibility to carry some of the load that the unit needed. And they all had to, this is where we get the expression, carry their own weight. Right? We all know what that means. We've all heard that. That's what this burden is. This refers to the backpack that those soldiers would carry. And that if every soldier carried what they were supposed to, none of them had too heavy or too light of a burden. They all worked together to move the overall burden. They were each responsible for a portion of it, and they worked together to move it. And so what Paul is saying here is if you are carrying your own burden, you're carrying your own responsibilities, the things that God has made you capable to carry, that aren't crushing, that aren't too much, you will not overwhelm somebody else by making them carry your part of the burden. We carry our own burden so that we don't overwhelm somebody else. We become a burden when the things that we should be responsible for, we expect someone else to do or carry for us. The problem with burdens is that sometimes the weight of these makes it impossible for me to do the other things that I normally can do, right? So I might normally be able to do this, but because now I have to carry all your stuff too, now I can't do my stuff. And so what Paul is encouraging them is you together as a church, you each have a responsibility. And if you're all doing your responsibility, you're not going to overwhelm each other. And then when the hard things happen in life and people are crushed, we'll have the ability to pick them up and walk alongside them. So, we carry the things that are our responsibilities. We live for one another, so we're never a burden to one another. So how do we do this? What does it really mean to bear or carry each other's burdens? I'm going to give you some practical things that I think are true and what this means and how we do this. Number one, to bear one another's burdens, we have to take care of ourselves first. Now that sounds selfish, but it's not. If you're on an airplane and they tell you if we crash, the masks are going to fall down, and what do they tell you? Put your own mask on first. Why? Because if you don't, you're going to die. You're helping everybody else, but now you're going to cause somebody else to have to help you because you didn't take care of yourself first. This is true spiritually as well. You have to make sure you're taking care of yourself. If God is the air that we breathe, you better put that mask on first and make sure you have the air to fill your lungs, to give you the strength, to give you the abilities that you need, so that now you are able and capable to help the people around you. We take care of ourselves first, not in a selfish way, but so I now have the ability to take care of the people around me who God has put in my life to take care of. Number two, to bear one another's burdens means that we don't judge. Now, this keeps coming up each week. Some of you are struggling with this because it's hard. But I want you to think of this way. When we're carrying somebody's burdens, what are we doing? We're helping them, right? So often judgment is hurting people. We're telling people, if I come to you and I want to help you up and I say, man, if you weren't this weak, I wouldn't have to do this for you. If you weren't this foolish and wouldn't keep making these mistakes, then I wouldn't have to do this. You shouldn't help and hurt at the same time, right? And so often what we call judgment tears people down and hurts them. It destroys them. And bearing burdens is us building them up and picking them up and carrying them. So there are kinds of judgments that are wrong. Now, the judgment that says they're hurting and they're struggling, that's not wrong. I've seen a problem and now I'm going to help them with it. But judgment that's hypocritical, judgment that is prideful, judgment that is destructive and tears people down, judgment that just points out, judgment that walks by and says, hey, you're stuck. You should really get up out of that hole. Does that help them? No. So we don't judge in a way that leaves people where they are or makes it even worse. We judge in a way that we see a problem and recognize that we could be stuck there too, and we want to help them out of it. Martin Luther once said, Christianity is just one beggar telling another beggar where to get bread. Recognizing we're all beggars. We all have problems. We all have burdens. We all have struggled. We've all stuck. I'm not any better than you. I'm just going to try and help you get what you need in this moment. That's not judgment. That's love. That's kindness. That's what we're called to. So when we talk about not judging, we have to ask ourselves, is what I'm going to say going to hurt them? Is what I'm going to say make this harder for them? Or is what I'm going to say help them get back on the right path that God has called me to get them on? Number three, bearing burdens is not solving problems. You can't solve problems. You're not called to solve problems. You're not called to tell people how to solve their problems. That's God's job. We're leading them to the one who can solve the problems, right? And so often, what we try to do in bearing one another's burdens is tell people what to do, tell people how to live their lives, tell people who they should be. Don't solve problems. You don't have the answers. A lot of times we don't even know the right questions. So stop trying to give them the answers. However, number 4, we develop a heart of prayer because we don't have the answers, but we know the one who does have the answers. And so our job is to help bring them before that throne of grace. Help bring them to the one who can give them answers to the struggles that they're in. A heart of prayer constantly wants to know how I can be praying for you. How can I be helping you? A heart of prayer is sensitive to needs and recognizes needs around us. A heart of prayer recognizes hurt and pain and hardship and wants to do something to help. A heart of prayer listens. It's attentive. It's caring. A heart of prayer is so often what those crushed by burdens needs. Oftentimes a heart of prayer isn't even lead to us actually praying. I had a couple people that I know recently who, just minor acquaintances, they don't know who I am, they don't even know that I'm a pastor, we just barely know each other. But I knew they had some people in their lives who were really struggling and sick. And it was a few weeks afterwards, and I came to them and I asked them how they were doing. And in that moment, to watch them change, I'd been praying for these people for those few weeks, and to see their demeanor change by me acknowledging, hey, I remember there's somebody in your life that was hurting, and I want to know how they're doing. I wasn't pushing prayer on them. I didn't want to push Jesus on them. I don't know where their walk is yet, but it opened up that conversation. I could see them change physically, and thank you for remembering that I have that problem. Let me tell you about. That's what a heart of prayer does. A heart of prayer wants to see those needs and know what's going on. Number 5, stop being self-consumed. That's how we bear one another's problems, burdens. So often we don't bear one another's burdens because I'm so stuck in my own problems that I can't even see your problems. The number one reason why we fail to help one another is because we can't think beyond ourselves. I can't get outside of my world to even begin to look at your world. When all you think about is yourself, you're not going to think of others. When your mind is still focused on you, you're incapable of seeing that people around you are struggling. And so if you're walking through life thinking, there's just nobody in my life that's having a hard time right now. Nobody's overburdened like that. That should tell you something. Because they are. People are hurting and struggling all around us. And it shouldn't take much for us to be able to see that. To bear one another's burdens, you have to have your mind on one another. I'm going to add a 6th here that's not on your list. As I thought about this yesterday, it should be obvious. I should have put it on there. But to bear one another's burdens, you have to strengthen your own spiritual muscles. Right? If that's too heavy for them, it doesn't help if it's too heavy for you too. So you need to be doing the things every day in your walk with God that enable you to be strong enough to help people when they need Him. If you're not praying for yourself, if you're not in the Word being strengthened by what He has for you, if you're not building those relationships with one another that we're called to, then you're not going to have the strength to help people when you see them. You're going to be overwhelmed just like they are. So you got to work out spiritually. You got to put that exercise in to be able to have the strength to help people when you need to. Now I want to give you a practical way to think about this. This is a story I read about an international student, went to a Christian college. And this student was on a student visa. So because of that, he couldn't get a job. It was just how his visa worked. Didn't have a job, so he didn't have much money. And then the student got really sick. It was one of those chronic coughs, just couldn't get better. Wasn't dying or anything like that, but he was really sick. He had no means to really help himself in this. So he was in class one day, and everybody knew he was sick. It was that kind of cough, right? Everybody around you doesn't want you to be there. That kind of sick. And one of the students went to him and said, hey, I'm really concerned about you. We can see that you're really sick. You know, there's a clinic right in campus. You can go to that clinic and they'll get you help. So I'm going to pray for you. And I'm going to pray that after class is over that you're able to go to that clinic and get help. Let's pause. Did that student bear the burden of the international student? Yeah. They showed compassion, right? They had the right hearts. That was good. What's the international student's real problem? That he can't afford to go to the clinic. And so what it did actually was push him down, because all it did was point to that he had this problem that he couldn't solve, and it made him feel ashamed. Everybody else sees that I'm sick, and I can't do anything to fix it. Just heaped a bunch of shame on him. Had the right heart. But here's the problem. At the end of the day, the student said, I'll pray for you, right? Prayer is not bearing one another's burdens. Prayer, now I want you to hear me, prayer is often the only thing we can do. That's true. But not all the time. Prayer is often the least that we can do. And we're doing it because it's easy. And there's no actual work put in by us. I want you to hear this from James. James chapter 2, verse 14 to 17. What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye, have a good day, stay warm, eat well, and then you don't give them any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. James says, what good is your faith that sees problems, hopes they get better, and then doesn't do anything? So are we called to have that heart of God towards one another? Yes, but we're also called to be the hands and feet of Jesus that actually do things to help each other. And again, sometimes there's nothing we can do, but usually there's something that we can do. So in the story, the professor walks in after all that happens and everybody's getting ready to start, and the professor sees that international student struggling, and the professor looks at the international student and says, have you been to the clinic yet? And he says, no. This is making it worse, right? Somebody else notices. And then the professor very pointedly said this, do you have the money to go to the clinic? And he said, no, I don't. So the professor got out his wallet, laid his cash on the table in front of him, said, that's not enough. Can anybody else help? All the students got up, gave a little bit of their money, and then he said, take the money, go to the clinic right now, and go get yourself what you need. Did he bear the burden? Yes. Did it change his sickness? No. Did it solve his problem? No. But it helped him get back on the right path to that, right? It recognized the problem, and it recognized the real problem. Not that he was sick, but that he couldn't afford to get well. And he needed somebody to help carry that burden for him so that he could go get on the right path to what he needs. That's what we're talking about today, friends. Prayer is great. Prayer is needed. And in fact, next week, we're going to see the call that we are to pray for one another. And we're going to see why that's so important. But prayer should not be the end. It should be the beginning. It should be the start of us bearing one another's burdens and not the finish. You're called not just to see eyes that see needs, but ears that are perceptive and can hear the real needs and the real heart so that we can give the help that's actually needed. The real need there wasn't that the student was sick, but he didn't have the means to get well. We need to stop thinking that there's nothing that we can do for people who are hurting. We need to stop just saying that we're going to pray and then do nothing about it. we need to recognize that we actually need to be the hands and feet and go out and help people lift those burdens so that they can get to Jesus, who can offer them the help they need. So we're going to close today, and I ask the worship team to come forward, and they're going to sing this song. It's called Come As You Are. And this song calls us to lay down our burdens, to lay down our shame, to lay down our hurts, to lay down our hearts before Jesus. And so I want to open this altar in two ways. Some of you have those burdens and you're struggling and you know it. Jesus tells us to bring our burdens to Him. If you're burdened, if life's too heavy right now, bring it to me and I will take it from you. And I'll give you my burden, which is easy and light. So if you have that burden today, this altar is open. I want you to come and bring that and lay it at His feet. There's a prayer team waiting in the chapel. They'll be happy to pray for you and talk to you about what you can do, what we can do to help you find what you need. But I'm going to open it another way. Some of you know people sitting around you who are burdened, who are overwhelmed, who are struggling, and they need you to help bring them to Jesus. To come sit beside them, to come pray with them, to come say, I'm going to bring you here to this altar. We're going to bring this to Jesus. And then, what can I do now? What can I do to be the hands and feet of Jesus for you this week? We don't need to change. We don't need to get rid of our burdens and then come to Jesus. You can come as you are today, overwhelmed, hurting, struggling, sick, and He'll take your burdens. And He'll change your life. Let's bring one another to Him today. And as we bring Him our burdens, let's see Him work in hearts and lives as only He can. We can't solve problems. Let's bring people to the one who can. So let's stand and sing this today as our prayer.